Welcome to the interview series. The interview series is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Leslie Kirk Campbell. Leslie Kirk Campbell's short fiction has appeared in Plowshares, Solos, and won awards at Arts and Letters, Southern Indiana Review, Briar Cliff Review, and the Thomas Wolfe Review. The author of Journey into Motherhood on Riverhead Books, Leslie is the mother of 2 grown sons and teaches at Ripe Fruit Writing, a creative writing program she founded in San Francisco. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So today we'll be looking at the titular story from The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs. And this is a book that came out on Sarabande in 2021,
2022, just a few months ago.
And this was a book that was actually selected by the Women's National Book Association to be a 2022 Great Group Read Selection. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that selection and then move into a brief summary of the story.
About the Great Groups Read Selection?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, so that is kind of cool because I discovered, I didn't really know about them until they selected my book, but now I know a little bit about them. And the Women's National Book Association was founded by women in 1917, before women even had to vote in the United States. A bunch of women with chutzpah and book lovers started it. And so it's all been going on all these years, supporting women authors and bookstores throughout the country. They have chapters all over the country. And they select 20 books each year to recommend to book groups. And I have to say, I've been invited to, through people I know so far, 3 or 4 book groups all over the country, in New Mexico, Albuquerque, up in Ann Arbor, in Bend, Oregon, and so on. So I joined on Zoom, but it's just such a delight to be there and have 10 men, women, or combination thereof, who've read my book, and they're sitting there conversing about all my characters, like the real, and they have all these ideas about themes and what they should have, the character maybe should have done or didn't do, and it just is, it's just and I also, they love it because they can ask me, different things. Why did you have your character do X or Y? And I just find it's a wonderful gift. I just did a book tour, a national book tour. I did about 20 venues around the country. It's great to have a live audience for sure. Some of those were on Zoom, but a lot of them were live. But number of the people haven't read your books. So in a book group, they totally know your book, like they know it better than you do. So it's like, it's very satisfying. It's very rewarding. Yeah, so that was great that they selected my book. That was a total surprise to me, and I hope that people reach out. And I hope that a lot of people read the book as a result. And if they reach out to me, I'm there. So.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. So The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, that's also the title of the collection and
Right.
the story we're going to be talking about. And right off the bat, the title is very interesting to me because, it does make me think of spiders immediately, right?
Yeah.
Could you provide a brief summary of the story? Because it's not about spiders.
No, it's not about spiders. Although it'll be interesting when I read the first draft, you're going to see something very interesting in relation to that. And I just have to say that since you mentioned that when I did one of my live readings was in Provincetown, in P-Town, in Cape Cod, and I noticed when they did, it was from the main library of P-Town, and their promo for the reading actually had a picture of Spider-Man crawling up the side of a building. So it's like, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, definitely. It interests people of all ages. I've discovered children as well. They're like the man with 8 pairs of legs. Ooh, what's
Yeah.
that? So yeah, it was the title definitely was kind of interesting. Anyway, the story, uh, the man with 8 pairs of legs, takes place in a conservative small town in Colorado called Canyon City, and which is sort of nestled between the Rockies and the Royal Gorge. And that setting is very important. That's also a city that has more prisons in it than any other county in the United States, and that also became important. So the character, the not just the town being the character, but the actual setting feels like a character. It's very critical to everything that happens in the story and the characters in the story. So it takes place in 1999, right at the end of the last century, millennium, and so on. And so one evening, Harriet, a 32-year-old maverick high school teacher who is intensely uncomfortable with her own body and in her own body, meets a young man at Lola's Saloon on Main Street in Canyon City, who she discovers once they undress is a double amputee from a coal mining accident. He's come to town to race in the Fremont County Fair, and so there's a lot of friction in town about whether a disabled man should be able to run with an able-bodied man. This was pre-Oscar Pistorius, and that was really important that I do it pre-Pistorius because then the Paralympics and so had become much more in the awareness of people. But for this was like, whoa, for this group of people at this time. The story, although it deals with many different themes like prejudice and disability and the way we hold uh, our past in our bodies and so on, is ultimately, I would say, at core, a love story. Lynette Landolph at Plaucher's called it a quirky love story that luckily she very much liked. So it's really, the story is really about the impact that Harriet and Callahan have on each other over a period of about 6 months, as they each come to terms with their own physical and mental imperfections and discover what is really most important to them.
Yeah, that's a great summary. In this particular story, did it come out of Oscar Pistorius, or did you? How did the idea manifest itself for you?
Yeah, no, it didn't come from Oscar Pistorius, although there was a photo I saw that I cut out, and I'm not sure at what point because I don't, years ago, whatever it was, of a track. And I myself was a varsity track runner in high school. I'm a runner, so that was the way I could also connect. And he's also a runner. Callahan, my character, is a runner. But there's this photo of that red dirt of a track, and there's the prosthetics for running track with their curved uh, feet, and they're just there with the shorts on them and no body. So they're just there. They and that there was a scene at one point where Callahan does race, and someone bumps into him, and the prosthetics are knocked off. I think that image was so. I just was fascinated by that image of these legs without the body laying on the track. But that wasn't what started it. What started it was actually a TED talk that I saw with this very confident double amputee woman who was talking, and behind her were about 4 pairs of legs, prosthetics, that were all really fascinating looking, and some of them look like works of art. And that intrigued me. I was kind of envious. I'm like, that's cool, and I wasn't that happy with my own legs. I always wanted to have them be a little more shapely in the calves, and I would try to lean against the wall and go up and down and up, try to get my calves, but never worked. And I'm like, hey, this girl has options. This woman can do stuff, like. So I thought that was very cool. And then around the same time, on a personal level, I was diagnosed with accident induced arthritis in my left hip. And that was from a really bad car accident I had when I was 21. So many years before, when I was abroad, studying abroad in Italia. I had a very bad accident, broke all my pelvis bones, and all this kind of thing. Anyway, it was related to that, and they said I should be in excruciating pain, the surgeons, and that I was a candidate for a hip replacement. And I realized that they'd be putting in, titanium or steel plates like my pots and pans, and I was like, no way, I do not want that. So those two things, I think, kind of galvanized, they connected and galvanized. And I think that's important. For me, I'm very much a writer of ideas. So the sort of the idea, though, was very visual, of that woman in the TED Talk. But then on a personal, very deep level, I think it's important for me that I'm coming from, there's something very deep in me that is pulling me to the content of each story that I write. But so then, as I began writing the story, then I became more interested in some of these thematic questions, like is technology its benefits on the one hand, but also what does it potentially cause humans to lose, and perhaps irretrievably? And one example I thought of is with a GPS. I mean, I was really a Luddite. I was the last person among hundreds of people I know who ever got a cell phone. I just held off and held off. And in terms of GPS, I was like, why are you using that? And just this voice. And I want to be able to navigate. I want my mind to be able to work. They're just different things. And so it made me think about, what does it mean to be human? Am I still human if I'm built? Like Callahan, or where is the line between bionic and human? And then it brought up, what are we humans, why are we drawn to enhancements of our bodies of all kinds, whether it be different colored contact lenses, which I think one of the students mentions in my story, dyeing the hair, but there's also Botox. There's so many things that people try to do to alter themselves, and so that intrigued me. And then the other thing that came up a lot was about prejudice. So here's this guy. That's what was important to me. It was definitely before Pistorius, although that doesn't mean there wasn't still prejudice, and there still is prejudice, and just stereotypes about people with disabilities, physical disabilities. But it made me think about how strangeness and the unfamiliar creates fear. And then I thought about how might that change with familiarity, because so Callahan is in this town for a while, and as you know from reading the story, there are, in fact, there are different factions within the town. Some more open-minded, some very upset and kind of biblical about it, which brings up Roe versus Wade, or when are we alive? These big questions about life and being human, and then over time things do change somewhat, and he becomes a more familiar sight, even if strange. And it talks about how some people use him almost iconically and put their own dreams and yearnings on him, and so it isn't that he is actually accepted as a real person. So, but what happens with familiarity, in relation to someone's fear about someone who's just really different from them, and then in addition, so there was that, but then there was also Harriet, who has an invisible kind of disability. She suffers internally. She's been bullied as a child, and she takes on also societal and internalizes societal sexism, the intense objectification of the body of women, which is something that I feel very personally strongly about. I personally have suffered, but women do more than I think sometimes maybe men realize. And she takes that pain in until she feels it like in every cell of her body, so that she can hear her blood circulating beneath her skin, and so there is that question, which comes up when they confront each other on the mountain at one point, between a physical disability. Is a physical disability, and that suffering more significant than an invisible one where another person can say, get over it, or not. So there's no answer to that, but those questions all came up from those initial experiences, my own personal experiences and the experience of seeing that woman and having that my hip, my arthritis, and so on.
Yeah, it brings up some interesting things that we kind of think about, talk about on a daily basis, but maybe don't uh, realize. And that is, the fact of comparing ourselves with others, um, and what we're trying to do or be, or uh, you know, do we think we're living a good life or not a good life, or you know,
Uh-huh.
these kinds of things. But it also brings up, you know, uh, the the idea that wherever you live, it does have an impact on your body, uh, because of the government, because of the terrain, right? All of these different things come into play. And, we do find some of that in here where, uh, as you've said, the town is divided on whether they should let Callahan run in this race.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but also, Callahan is getting different pairs of legs to do different activities.
Right.
And so, not every pair of prosthetics is fit for, say, mountain climbing, or going through snow,
Mm-hmm.
as simply walking, which obviously, as Callahan talks about in the story, he had to relearn how to do,
Yeah.
using prosthetics.
Right. Right. I just thought of something. I just thought how um this reversal that's going on where an able-bodied person might think that a physically disabled person would be always comparing themselves with able people and go, God, I wish I had, you know, an arm if they didn't have an arm, like all these people and things like that. And instead, in my story, it's sort of a reversal because the able-bodied character, Harriet, is the one who's comparing herself and envying and wishing she had what the disabled person has. So I think that sort of an intriguing reversal of what might be expected.
Definitely, yeah. So we're going to look at the beginnings and endings of an early draft and then the published version. Um,
Uh-huh.
and so I kind of wanted to talk about the different parts of a story. And we're talking about short stories today.
Right.
Uh, what is important about a story's beginning? What does it have to do?
So I have very strong opinions about beginnings. So I think the beginning is everything. It sets the tone for the whole story. And once a writer understands the meaning of the story, something it takes multiple revisions to puzzle out, at least for me. I mean, I revised the story numerous times over 7 years. I think it's important to say that. This story, of all the stories in my collection, took the longest to achieve whatever it could possibly do. So it took longer to puzzle out. So over those multiple revisions, what an author understands the story more and more, and the beginning can hold the seeds of everything that follows, and it's also the gateway. Another way of thinking about it. So it holds the seeds of everything that is to follow. It's also the gateway into the narrative dream. It's and that's I like thinking about. I like that term that it's come into my purview in the last few years. The narrative dream of the story. And in fact, when I do my readings, I always ask people to close their eyes. I invite them to close their eyes and just listen to my voice, and as a way of not being distracted by the visuals of the bookstore and just entering into the narrative dream I'm creating for them. The beginning also creates a promise to the reader, um, of what the kind of story it's going to be. Is it going to be kind of ironic? Is it ironic? The tone. Is it realistic, speculative, comic? So it can also give instructions as to how to read the story. the beginning. So acting as an initial guide, like you introducing and giving context to me before this interview. Or I always think of, because I love Gogol, the Russian writer Gogol, how I loved how when he, in his in the work that I read of his, like he'd be there as it'd be Issy was there, and there was this narrator who'd be guiding you around St. Petersburg. Oh, and now we're coming here, and now this is going to happen, and so the beginning can do all those things. In addition, it has to hold a level of authority that inspires confidence in the reader, so that the reader feels like, oh, I'm going to take this journey. I feel safe. I feel interested. And this writer is going to be able to hold me. They're not going to disappoint me or trick me or abandon me midstream, you know? So I think that is important too. And then on the plot level, it needs to start with an unstable ground situation that precedes the beginning of the story. And that is related to a John Barth essay that when we talk about maybe the ending or the middle, I can talk more about. But for the beginning, I've taught short fiction for ever since I went back and got my MFA in 2011 at Bennington writing seminar, and that is one thing that I find is really important. The unstable ground situation that precedes, it doesn't happen in the story typically, but precedes the beginning of the story, so that it feels volatile just as you begin, and so there's like this energy, right? It's not like calm, like a little pond with no ripples. Yeah, and so one thing that I found when I was thinking about beginnings and endings and revision in general is this quote from Steve Jobs. I just like this very short quote. I think you'll love it. You're probably familiar with it, Matthew. I don't know. He just said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards." So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. And I thought, so that's a little bit off just the beginning, but in relation to revision and early drafts, I thought about that because in different ways, that I mean, as an approach to writing, just that trust, which I in my teaching called the writing faith, FAITH, that I work with students on this basic trust or faith, which is led by the right brain, the imagination, intuition, to go forward on that deep level, and not, they're like, what if I don't know what? I said, just keep going, just keep going. And it's related to that, you cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And when I read that, I also thought of that in terms of the whole collection, which were these stories that I wrote over these 6-7 years that I had to write, and I was not thinking of a collection. I didn't even think of a book. I didn't even know I could write a book. I was just trying to figure out how to write fiction. And it was only after that, basically because a literary agent said, well, what brings these all together? How are we going to sell this book? That I looked at it and discovered that there was something about the body and the way the body holds memory, often literally and visibly, with scars, bruises, heroin tracks, tattoos, as well as invisibly, like with Harriet, that really ran through the book and that could hold it together. But I didn't know that. So you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. I just love that. So I thought I'd share that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I didn't know that particular quote, but it makes a lot of sense. Because, oftentimes when you're moving forward, you're not exactly sure where you're going, even if you have a planned destination. Uh, and, even if you have a planned destination, it doesn't mean you're going to get there.
Right, exactly. That's definitely the case. In fact, I found, I might have in the story thought I was going to get to a certain place and was working like crazy to make that happen. So that's what's starting to force things, in a way, by trying to connect dots before they've, doing the opposite of what he's saying. I wasn't trusting that the dots and the characters, as I got to know them, would have to make the choices that they would make, and which would create a different result.
Definitely, yeah. No, I recently talked to Joe Mino and about his new book
Yeah.
and the Book of Extraordinary Tragedies, and he said he originally wrote the first part of the book as a short story, um, and in the early 2000s, and
Ah,
and his book didn't come out until this year
yeah,
because it took him that long to figure out what was happening with the characters and what was really going on in the story. Uh, and he played around with different characters in the book for a long time and what they were doing.
yeah,
And I think, that's another example of the Steve
yeah.
Jobs quote.
I'd be curious to know what got him to expand that short story into a novel. Because I mean, any of my short stories, I could imagine I could expand into a novel. But I love the compression, density, and poetic possibilities of the short story form.
Yeah, well, to, yeah, why do you like that so much more than say a novel? Or is that I mean, that's a comparison again, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But I guess what draws you to the compact narrative?
Um, I started as a poet. I was a poet since I was 9 years old. I mean, I wrote my first poem when I was 9. Let's put it that way. I didn't necessarily identify as a poet, but I discovered my love of language, and then I continued writing poetry in high school, college, graduate school. Got a master's in poetry, taught poetry at San Francisco State University in creative writing classes, and was writing poetry and reading poetry readings and so on. And it is related to my absolute love of language, and so since I've been teaching with my this Ripe Fruit Writing, or the Ripe Fruit School of Creative Writing, all these years, I founded in 1991, here in San Francisco. I have a curriculum that starts with the writing faith, so that's related to that idea I just told you about, that basic trust, and building from there the art of languaging. And before going to writing memoir, focusing on deep revision, and then short fiction. Because if I were to just have students just come in with their short stories, a bunch of people trying what they think are short stories, whatever they think, they're trying to write a short story. If the language wasn't interesting, I would basically get bored. So I wouldn't want to do that. So I like working with students who've worked with me, who have learned what a poet knows about language, the texture and the musicality of language, the way, as poets, I'm not writing poetry now, but I identify still also as a poet. So I can say the way we care so much about metaphor, about the power of metaphor, which Aristotle says is the soul of poetry, which I agree, and with the echoes. And I'm interested in the actual auditory rhymes and off rhymes that occur, but also ideational rhymes that occur, image rhymes that occur. And so I think of it almost like a collage, like a work of art and a collage. And I do have an idea for a novel where the main character is an ornithologist. That I feel it's that one idea I have for one. I feel I could manage. I can probably. I mean, I'm always going to be caring about every sentence, and I'm going to be listening. I always listen to my work out loud. All these stories I've recorded, listened to them out loud along the way, and closing my eyes, just hearing. And because I would be instructed by what I heard. to alter things in relation to what I'm hearing in terms of the music and the rhythms and so on. Um, yeah, so there's all, and then I also like the challenge, I think, of like, uh, I mean, I loved it when my agent Felicia asked talked about the stories as being like immersive, like novels. She said, I mean, other people have said that too. Actually, some of the New York publishers that didn't end up accepting the collection did talk about that. So I liked the idea of and my stories, as you see, are relatively long, short stories, a lot of them. Seeing what I could accomplish in a smaller space became part of the puzzle, and I love puzzles. I just love puzzles. So
Yeah.
at some point, I might have the puzzle of how to keep up an orchestration of language and story, in something that is like 300 pages in one book. And one other quick thing I can mention is I moved when I was a child. I was in like 10 different cities, or maybe 8 different cities, or 12 different schools. I changed school almost every year. My father was a professor, and he kept moving around. And then I kept having that kind of restlessness when I went to college, going overseas, going to Italy, having that car accident, moving around after that. I've been with around so many different kinds of people. And, so I think it might be very different if I had just, was born in Palo Alto, lived in Palo Alto, went to school in Palo Alto, stayed in Palo Alto. My family was there. And I was always kind of around the same people. But I've been in love with and with such a diversity of people. And so the characters that inhabit me and the stories, there's just, I need, at least in these first, as I've started fiction, there are a number of stories that I want to write. So also I'm getting old. I went back to fiction older in my 50s. I went back to school in my 50s. So it's like, I don't have time to write 10 novels. So let me see if I can get some of these stories out in a shorter form.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so speaking of language, let's get some of your language in the air here. I'm going to bring up the beginning of the first draft of The Man with Eight Pairs of Legs and ask you to read it for us.
Okay, I might read it to, a little bit beyond that ballpark. So this is how, when I first wrote it in its first draft, which was when I was at Bennington, 2012. Once upon a time, a bomb exploded under a young man's Jeep. The parts of the Jeep, like the parts of the men, lay scattered in the lateral ditch and over the desert road. Meanwhile, armored Jeeps, whose final screws were being turned, even now, by robotic arms, in a warehouse outside Detroit, would arrive on cargo ships, docking at Khazar, and roll down the ramp, a column of shiny replacements. He lay like a mauled animal, facing the sky, his legs mangled, one foot tossed to the side, his mouth shaped like a smile until the pain set in. Harriet thought it was a fairy tale when he first told her, the two-legged to the zero-legged, amputated below the knees, he had said, to multiple pairs. She thought of the delicate dust mill of centipedes she'd toyed with as a kid in the dirt, pill bugs on their backs, the tiny wagging limbs, the invisible feet. In nursery school, she'd drawn multiple legs on villains in different colors, dangling like strings, and always with a quick, short line for feet. Never princesses for Harriet or fairy godmothers, the things that children happily remember.
Thank you. So
So
this,
none of that is there. None of that is there in the final version.
no, I know. It's still good. It's still good though. You can, I kind of tried to zone out a little bit so I could just listen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
Good.
didn't want to close my eyes because I felt like that would be rude on camera. But But yeah,
Uh,
you can hear what the language is doing, and I think that's one of the things with language. Like it can take you to that place just by the sound that you're hearing, and
yeah,
that's a wonderful thing.
yeah.
So this went through multiple workshops, um, and so I'm interested in how these workshops helped you through these drafts to reshape the beginning of this particular story.
So workshops have been so crucial to the development of this story and all my stories. I mean, yeah, all my stories really. Pretty much all of them have been workshopped. Um, to me, they're a key to understanding what the story is about. That long process I'm talking about. That process, so that takes time and risk taking, and for me, an incredible amount of solitude and concentration. I just got back from a 10-day writing retreat at Playa in remote Southern Oregon. And this is where I'm happiest because I can work 12 hours a day on my writing, go to sleep with my writing in my head, wake up and just roll out of bed and go right to my table. And speaking of immersive, that's where I feel like I get the depth and complexity that I'm after, um, is with that kind of solitude. So, I'm diving in again and again alone, uh, in this story and all my stories, really. But what the workshops did for me is a number of things that I I've discovered that I find that all feedback is helpful. I know people can be maybe judgmental about, oh, I don't want to hear, I don't care what that person says or whatever. But you in the workshops where I did a number of them after I finished Bennington's, I went to Tin House 3 times in 2 summers and one winter workshop. I went to Napa Valley Writing Conference 3 times. I went to Breadloaf once. I went to New Harmony once, and I had my own fiction group. But and I went to Juniper. So that's quite a bit because I kept going back because they were fabulously rewarding to me to be around a number of people. And sometimes you have to read everybody's work, and maybe there would be, for it's all subjective. It's someone's work maybe I didn't, I wasn't attracted to it that much, but what they had to say in workshop was like blew my mind. So it was like it didn't matter, the gift, like with the in a way, like the book groups, is that all these people have read your story. It's just as in I mean it's an invaluable gift to have these interesting and intelligent, just any human. They don't even have to be writers necessarily. They're just humans reading your story closely and then having some response to it. So whatever it is, it could be more about language, about character, or confusion here, or it doesn't need this, but whatever it is, um, it seems so important, so important. So I realize that what I'm doing is allowing my story as it's evolving to converse with the world. Otherwise, it'd be all alone. Um, I'm allowing it to converse with the world, and it made me think. When I think of that idea, it makes me think of a child who's homeschooled versus a child who's in public school. So it's like I homeschool my stories for a certain amount of time, and they're solo and it's kind of insular, and then we go so far, and then take it to public school, where it hits up against all these different personalities and ideas and ends up in a conversation and learns about itself, what it can be. um, so it grows in relation to others. And I don't know how many people actually really think about that much, but for me, I definitely feel my stories grown with others. There's little moments in different stories. I thought, oh, I remember that guy in my fiction workshop, Scott, suggested that one phrase, and there it is in the story. Like, I mean, there are little things, literally sometimes, that from the feedback. So, and then I always gather as a process. I say there's 10 people in the workshop. I get all the 10 manuscripts. I take one manuscript. and I write down, or I mean, on my computer with one of the, with a draft that I've given to everybody. I put all the feedback into that whole draft, and I even say who it was that said it, because I like to know. And I just sort of let that sit for a while, and try to listen to what the conversation is telling me about my story. Um, so I have found that incredibly beneficial. Uh, I do want to say that it is possible. There is a danger of losing one's way, and I have a couple times. There is a couple workshops um, where one workshop at Napa where I left the workshop, and there was a reception afterwards, and I just sat in my car in the parking lot and sobbed and called my best friend. I am never going to write again. I can't write again. You know, or at some point, you have to be careful not to let the feedback voices get too loud, louder than your own instincts. And listening too much to things that they need for the story to work for them. But 95% of the time, these feedback feasts galvanize my process, shake things up, allow me to go deeper, and the story inevitably evolves. Not necessarily to maturation, but I had this, it grows from childhood to puberty to adolescence until finally at 25, its brain is formed.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
so so that's something. And so I looked at all the different beginnings. So I had such a vast different beginnings as the years progressed. One of the Jeep exploding in Iraq that we just read, with that kind of narrative distance. There's one with a priest presiding over the funeral of Harriet's grandmother. One started with a Christmas faculty party at Harriet's high school. There was one that started, quote, the day Terry Schiavo's feeding tube was removed amid the national uproar about the mute woman's rightful fate. Harriet Rogers, a 32-year-old history teacher at Calvin Coolidge High School in Kansas City, asked her 10th graders what they would do if someone they loved could still breathe on their own and look at them with love from their hospital bed, but couldn't move, think, eat, or speak, And so I had all these different ones until I ended up with Harriet driving home at night from the bar after meeting Callahan. And then in the final version, the camera pulls back again. Interestingly, like the first earliest one, the one I read, was way back, the Jeep in to this panoramic kind of view of the place, of the setting, and Harriet's place in it, establishing the town itself as a character in the story, like a kind of Greek chorus, before bringing the camera in close to Harriet taking off her winter coat in a bar and sliding into a booth. And one thing I want to say, just as I learned, from all the feedback from workshops, I learned from all these different beginnings, like that Terry Scavo thing. Why would I learned more how about Harriet as a teacher, the kind of things she would bring to bear, the kind of difficult, complex moral questions she would lay on her senior high school students, to really consider. It wasn't light fare. And, the explosion taking off a young man's leg, of course, went from Iraq to a coal mine incident. And that was really an important choice, because that was very early feedback, was like, I don't know. I don't care how conservative the town is. If it's a vet, they're going to be a lot more sympathetic. So I realized I didn't want that to be, and I didn't want that to affect it. So I discovered, coal mining. Looked up the history in Colorado. He's from Gunnison. I looked at actual coal mining incidents, and went from that. Each beginning that I started with, I started with the grandmother's funeral. That was the thing that was so volatile in the beginning. The volatile thing, the unstable homeostatic ground situation for this story, for the present time of the story, is that Harriet had lost her grandmother, but importantly, that grandmother was the only person in the whole community, colleagues, her mother, her stepfather, stepbrothers, that really got that invisible internal suffering she had inside her. She was the only one who could just put her hand on her arm, and talk about how long it took to create the gorge over 2 million years, whatever, to soothe her anxiety and a sense of understanding her suffering. So that was critical. That, I mean, that was a big deal that she had just lost that one person. Um, and and then a couple things about feedback in general. So early on, when I did the workshop at Tin House, that was a quite early draft of The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, and that's where Charles D'Ambrosio, who was my teacher, who's writes short stories and essays, and is, for the record, an absolutely brilliant teacher, absolutely brilliant teacher. In our one-on-one that we had after the workshop, he talked to me about the most he here I was, with the race. The guy came to town to do the race, and he was like, I don't know that the story has to go to the point of the race. What you really need to do is bring those two characters who I didn't really know that well yet into a room, get them into the room as fast as possible. That bedroom, Matthew, that they ended up being in, and see what happens. So, and that was very, I know it's very fundamental, but it was really important to me at that time to hear that. And then he also confronted me with this question of, he asked me if he wondered if I had the courage to write the story that I seemed to be writing. And I was like, fuck, I don't know if I do. Like, whoa, what does he see that I'm not seeing, or something? I just really thought a lot about that. I said, I have to keep letting go. I have to keep going farther than I thought. No holds barred, that was a kind of a riveting, deep confront, in a way, to what I could even pull out of myself. And courage is such an important part of writing something that is worth reading. So that was really powerful. And then one other anecdote is really late in the game, when I was at Juniper, and I was working with, and Joy Williams was the teacher, and this was when I'm 2019. Okay, I wrote the first draft in 2012. Now it's 2019, and I'm like, I've got this story together, man. It's been through workshops and people, and I've done all this, and the people there, liked a lot of things, but they said, there were things, like it doesn't need Harriet's father. It doesn't need this long Christmas dinner with a family, which was like about 7 pages, which I loved. And the inference of molestation by the stepfather. It doesn't need Callahan's attempt to change Harriet to stop smoking, eat healthier meals, to have her get into better physical shape. And the real thing was, it doesn't need the race, they were saying. Not that it didn't get, for Charles Dickens, it was more like the story doesn't have to reach that chronologically, but for them, it doesn't need to be in the story at all. And I'm like, whoa. So, and some of those people were like 1/3 my age, which was very humbling. And so that's another thing. I'd packed too many things into the story at that point. I listened to they were saying all these things. I took all those things out. I tried it, and then everything fell into place. And then that's when I finally sent it out, and Gloucester Solos, or Ladette, loved it. And so it was worth all that time and work and stuff. Anyway,
Yeah.
so there's so much I could say about workshopping, and then I teach, so we workshop people's work. It's just powerful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you work on a thing so long and you're finally like, yeah, this is it. This is it.
I
And
got
then
it.
and then you show it to like one person and they're like, what about this? And you're like, ah, damn it. You're right. You're right. you know, and then
Right, right, right.
you're like, well, I got to go back and look at that a little bit more.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, and so there, I know there's always that question: when do you know when you're done?
Yeah,
Um, and that's sort of a mystical question, I guess. But when I puzzled that out after that last workshop for this story, it did feel done because I hadn't sent it out ever before. Like other stories of mine, I'd sent out, while they were still evolving, although I didn't know that they're necessarily going to have to still evolve. And they came back. I worked on it, sent out another level. But this one story is the one I only sent out once, and it got into one of the literary magazines that I most esteemed. So um, it's just one of the things like you just know. I think you at some point you know.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, you can't just sit on it forever either, right? Like,
Oh no. On to the next one. On to the
yeah.
next one.
So let's can we hear a little bit of the final draft that appears in your book,
Sure.
the beginning of?
Um, Canyon City was not a city. It was a small, gossiping, high security town in Colorado's high desert, bordered to the west by the Sawatch Range. A home rule municipality boasting 13 prisons and 50 churches. Its 10,000 people, one fifth of them locked up, governed themselves as they saw fit and thrived on the stories, true or false, they told themselves. Everyone in Canyon knew that 34-year-old Harriet Rogers, the reclusive 6 foot tall history teacher at Coolidge High, was not a drinker, nor did she hang out in bars. But on this clear, wintry night, heading down Main Street toward the interstate, her Buick, like a stubborn horse, bucked and halted in front of Lola's saloon of its own accord. Or at least that's how the town later came to explain it.
Thank you. Yeah, I really do like the horse simile there at the end. I don't know. It's like one of those things where it it just feels right. You know what I mean? Like uh, I it's hard to explain because I haven't lived with this story as long as you have. But
Yeah.
because it's a saloon, it just feels right that somehow the car as a horse like takes Harriet to the saloon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then it continues right after that. Harriet worked her lanky frame into a dark back booth and shrugged off her winter coat. And so then it goes on focusing on her. But it starts with that omniscience and it ends and ends up ending with omniscience. And so it in the end it does deal with that idea that I told you before about having holding everything, the seeds of the story in that beginning, um, that paragraph, and then of course the next paragraph. But a lot of it is just right there in that part I just read. I mean, instead of starting with him like the one I read earlier, that early draft, which was, I really like it too, actually, as writing. But um, there was a point where I realized that the town was an important character, and the context within which all this happened was an important character, and that frame then ended up holding the whole story of Harriet and Callahan's love story.
Yeah. So how, we've talked about the workshops and how you get there, different ideas about how to revise the story from people. Um, the middle seems like the place that maybe is talked about the least in a story. Only I say this only insofar as like the beginning and ending are so important because they have to do kind of specific things.
Yeah.
But the middle is almost this gray area where you're like, well, what needs to go here in the middle? How do you think about middles of stories?
I think the middle of the story is the hardest part. You've got all these things out on the table, all these ingredients that you've introduced, and they're kind of starting. And then, yeah, sometimes you have a sense of maybe an ending. You might prematurely have connected the dots. But so for me, with this story, what the story needed in the middle and lacked in many of the drafts was conflict and a strong structural element. Some of the elements of that Barth talks about. I knew early on that Harriet was going to contemplate cutting off her own legs. I knew that early on, very early on, or possibly actually cutting off her legs, which she does do in some of the drafts, or seems he's doing at the end. I mean, there's actually blood. So, and I kept focusing on getting to that end in a credible and hopefully interesting way. There were the months that went by before the race, to give it a kind of time structure also. So in terms of structure, so as now it's March, now it's April, the race is on this particular day. So I'm going to use these as kind of time markers. And I don't remember if it was somebody in my workshop, or I think it was my agent actually. Somebody suggested using the arrival of the legs as a structure. Um, so so I mentioned already that the dinner of the Harris family was there demonstrating their prejudice against a person with a disability. But then I realized that the town was carrying that work, and that those relationships weren't important and were detracting from the relationship in Harriet and Callahan. And some of the other things, Harriet trying to change her body at the gym, as they pointed out later, but I was holding on to them. Anyway, the middle, I learned, can get flabby and random and lose its way, as you said. So the story needs conflict, but it needs it with the right person. And I had conflict with Harriet and her mother for quite a while, and I just let go of that. Or something about, like I said, the inference of molestation between the stepfather and her, that was getting in the way. Something about even a father who, her original father, walking off into the snow and disappearing. And then he finally really did disappear from the story completely and utterly. He never started in the, he was never there in the first place. Now I'm at this point. And so what I didn't have, what I needed was between Harriet and Callahan. That's where the conflict needed to be. So once I had the prosthetics coming in, you know, and and then I thought about how sometimes the solution can be right in front of your nose and you can't see it, but at some point you see it. And there's so many elements and so many variables and so many decisions to make in a story. I think it's just, beyond belief that anyone can even do it. I mean, I'm not trying to brag myself. I'm just, all these writers and writing novels and short stories, I mean, if someone say tried to redo their kitchen, I've never done that, but I have friends who do. I think, wow, there's so many decisions you have to make, colors and all these things. But in a story, that's just like, it's astronomical how many decisions are being made. Don't you think that's incredible, Matthew?
Oh, I do.
It was like, how do we do it? I don't even know
I
how we do it.
that's why it
Like
takes so long.
every word combination, I mean, and on and on and on. What the person is going to feel or think in this, microsecond. What about this microsecond? And so on. So, um, but it was when I committed to Harriet and Callahan and let the legs act as markers for moving the story forward, each one introducing more conflict. That was another part of it. Each of those legs, when they arrived, introduced more conflict between them, that the story finally fell into place. It was truly as if the story had a head and shoulders and calves and feet, but no trunk.
Right.
And so the middle needed to push towards a turning point, and the turning point pushes towards a climax. So that's related to this architecture that I've been referring to. And in this case, in this story, it was the scene on the mountain that was critical. Um, it was it was on that wintry hike on Harriet's favorite mountain that leads to the turning point for Harriet in terms of her relationship with her body. Um, so there are no easy ways out with the middle. I think a writer just has to discover what her story is about over multiple revisions, as I've said, and conversations with others. And with that increased understanding, she strengthens the core and lets the unwanted limbs, pardon the pun, to let go. You just let go of them, and certain threads and limbs, you let go of them.
The idea of pruning, much like a tree, for your limb pun.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's so deep though. I always talk to my students about the difference between editing and revision, or
Right.
and deep revision. It's just sort of this magical thing that you really an author really has to be alone a lot to, I think, discover some of these things. I mean, somebody said you need to have a scene with them in the middle, and I thought it was a great idea. But then out of nothing, it seemed like, all of a sudden that scene became such an important scene in the whole story.
Yeah. No, it's it is amazing as you said earlier, you need so much time to kind of inhabit the lives of these characters to figure out what the story is actually trying to do, where it's
Yeah,
going. Um, and like you say, like there's ways you can do kind of superficial pruning with certain words, sentences, scenes, and so forth, but then actually going back and writing in new things, even if they don't work,
yeah.
often get you to
You
think
learn from them.
about the main things that really need to happen.
Yeah, you learn from them. It makes you think. It just, I there's this guy Mike who helps me garden once a month in my garden. I love my garden. It's really important to me. And so it could be like the pruning part, like cleaning the leaves that fall down and deadheading old buds, dead buds, and things like that. Or should this flower go in, or this plant go in here? And I like this orange with this, and so on. But he's like, what we really have to do is amend the soil. We have to dig deep and get nutrients into the soil. Like all that is, like the editing was all that other stuff, but the deep revision is, what it's all going to be growing out of, so that flower can be all that it can be. I just thought of that is kind of a nice analogy for this kind of work, that sometimes if you keep the same draft and just kind of tweak it here and there, what I needed to do is really go deep into having more nutritious soil, and things that out of which everything else could grow, and then those same flowers would look magical, and otherwise they would maybe last a few minutes and then die or something.
Yeah,
Like they'd be beautiful for a moment, for that Instagram photo, and then they'd be gone.
right. Well, let's look at the end of this. The
Okay,
the, the flower, as it were, in bloom. Let's look
the
at
early draft.
the early draft, the ending of the early draft here. If you could read a little bit when you're ready.
Yeah. No, Harriet couldn't be on the front lines in battle. God had given her 2 legs and then let her keep them. But she was here with Callahan on the couch, his head now in her lap. No one knew, and no one would know. Her plan took shape when she remembered the old Ohlone legend about the Indian who escaped from his prisoner chains at a California mission by cutting off his foot. He had then become a leader of the resistance. Or that hiker who fell into a ravine and had to cut off his hand to get out from under a boulder, who became a popular stand-up comedian. She pictured members of his audience recalling his jokes in bed or at bus stops and laughing out loud. Men and women cutting their limbs in order to save themselves. People sculpting themselves like artists. With Callahan's morphine, she wouldn't feel anything. She would do one and then the other. She fondled Callahan's crew cut and remembered how steadily he navigated her that first night at Lola's, his warm hands on her hips, and how each week now he seemed less enchanted.
Thank you. So, right, we've talked about the middle, reaching the climax. What do you have to do after the climax? How do you end a story?
so I I've mentioned, so there's this John Barth essay called Incremental. I mean, it's very highfalutin name, right? Incremental perturbation, how to know when you've got a plot or not. And Barth was not someone who was really very plot oriented. So I was very intrigued because I was very bored by the Freytag pyramid that I'd seen with, you just exposition, rising action, falling action, like it was boring and repetitive, and it didn't tell me how. It had no energy to it. It was just flat. So according to him, a successful story is the incremental perturbation of an unstable homeostatic system. That's what I mentioned, that ground situation preceding the story. And so the incremental perturbation of an unstable homeostatic system and its catastrophic restoration. I love that. Catastrophic, that's big.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I've achieved that in the story, a catastrophic restoration to a complexified equilibrium. So it's a mouthful, but it's so meaningful to me. A complexified equilibrium. So I think the Raymond Carver's Cathedral is a great example to me of doing all those things. And you're just like blown away at the end, like, nothing seemingly major has happened, but it's definitely a complexified equilibrium after with the main character, drunken and similarly to, sort of prejudice against a blind man, uh, friend of his wife, and how Carver achieves this equilibrium in the way they connect at the end. So I believe that that an ending needs to resonate with the beginning of the story. And one of my teachers, Jim Shepard, had often talked about you can't really write your beginning until you write your ending. But I mean, of course, you have to write something. But he just would emphasize it. When you finish and understand so much more and you finalize your ending, then take a look again at the beginning and make sure that it's holding everything. I guess at least in my words, holding everything. But the beginning holds the seeds of everything, but the end holds the weight of everything. I just I thought about that. Like, so the beginning holds the seeds of everything, and the end holds the weight of everything. Yet it needs to have a lightness to it, not be burdened in any way. I love it, and there is in Carver's Cathedral. There's this lightness to it, but there's also this depth, incredible depth to it as well. I'm a very visual writer, and so I often end my stories with an image. I want the end to remain open, not to slam shut. I want it to resonate after the last word. Leave the reader dazed. That would be my goal, to leave the reader dazed, in thought, surprised, but unexpectedly satisfied. If I've done that, then I've done my job, I feel. Echoes of all the work I've done in all the previous pages need to be there, like refrains coming back in an orchestral piece. Again, that's my goal. So I think of it also musically, as I said. And yeah, so I have found Barth, I won't get into it right now necessarily, but that ground situation preceding, and then the dramatic vehicle. You have a volatile situation preceding it, and the dramatic vehicle is something that enters usually within the first page of pretty early, very early on. That I think of it chemically like a petri dish. That if you put this particular thing in it, it's going to explode, like those little volcano baking soda and vinegar, whatever that does. Or you could put something in it where nothing happens. But you actually need to have a dramatic vehicle. That's Barth's term, a dramatic vehicle connecting with the volatile energies preceding the story that ignites enough energy to push us through to the very end of a story. And that's what I mean, that, you know, rising action, falling action, that didn't teach me that. But Barth's take on it, and thinking about that, and I've analyzed dozens of stories using that, whether they're very plot driven or not. And I find that it works, and that by using that in things that aren't working, it's really helpful to see why it's not working, and it helps me as well. So I want to give a shout out to John Barr's Incremental Perturbation: How to Know If You Have a Plot or Not. It's just really great.
No, it's incredibly useful, and I also, your explanation about like doing your job as the writer uh,
Yeah.
sounds incredibly hard. But
Well, didn't I tell you it took 7 years
yeah,
for one fucking story? I mean,
yeah.
come on.
Well, would you like to read a little bit of the end of the final published version?
Sure.
Just so we can hear a little bit of that, and then yeah.
Yes. Well, it kind of, I'm going to read a little second. So I wanted you to hear the tone. Um, on the day of the fair, I just want to hear how the race doesn't come into in a way.
Okay.
Doesn't. On the day of the fair, all of Fremont County would be waiting for Callahan. Even a few lucky prisoners, cuffed to security guards, who had made a special request. In a makeshift press box, a handful of journalists from Denver and Pueblo would be standing at the ready, cameras and notepads in hand. But Callahan would not come, an absence the people of Canyon would never be able to explain. You notice I said that in the very first paragraph, that they would never be able to explain.
Yep.
That's a repeat. They might imagine him off to the side of the track, poised in his cheetahs like a strange bird, or try to conjure him crouched with the others before the gun went off, even picturing the blur of his blades speeding around the track. But that afternoon, when the gun went off and their able-bodied men shot off their starting blocks, something had already changed inside them. They might stomp and yell from the bleachers for their son or brother to win, but beneath that zeal, too quiet for them to hear, an inexplicable sadness would enter them, so that by the time the human race was all said and done, and they had filed from the bleachers to buy prize-winning apples and taste homemade pies, they would feel the gravity of it, a peculiar longing, as if the future might never come. And then I'm not going to read the little dialogue, but in the very end, the camera goes back onto. I think my story is very cinematically. So there's camera, panoramic. Now the camera is coming in close. At noon, Callahan sat up and announced he'd like to take Harriet to Gunnison, to the site of what had once been Buckhorn Mine, which is where he had his coal mining accident. She laid out his lidocaine and gabapentin on the kitchen counter. After dressing, he helped her onto his motorcycle in his $2 chucks, and they sped through the high desert. Harriet leaned into his back, tightening her grip around his waist, as if they were one person. Before turning west on the Highway 50, Callahan pulled into Royal Gorge Bridge Lookout, setting his boots down so they could take in the view. A few tourists were snapping photos. The 1,260-foot bridge looked white in the midday sunlight, its giant aluminum chains slung between castellated steel girders, marring the natural landscape, but beautiful too, even exquisite. The Arkansas River, 1,000 feet below. Its construction in 1929 had seemed an impossible feat, and yet here it was, the tallest suspension bridge in the world, linking what had taken 3 million years to sever.
Excellent. Thank you.
So that's a lot different than her sitting there cutting off her legs, huh?
Yeah, very, very, very different. So, you spent at least 3 days, maybe longer, looking at your own revisions for The Man with Eight Pairs of Legs. And as you've said earlier, you have looked at a bunch of different stories written by other people
Mm,
and tracked how they were working, particularly through the John Barth lens. Uh,
yes.
what did you learn about your own revisions? And it was, you said this was a great exercise for you.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, so maybe you could talk about it a little bit.
Well, for one thing, I really got to hand it to you. I'm so grateful to you because all that work I did, I know I'm going to use it to in future workshops that I lead myself, about revision. So that was awesome. Um, I would never have done it if you hadn't suggested to do it. And then I got totally into it. And so I was so kind of wowed by everything that I noticed and learned. But what was most amazing was both how much things had changed, and I hadn't remembered how many things had started in different ways, been there and taken out one, but also perhaps even more importantly, how the core of the story really stayed the same. In other words, my original intuition of what I was grappling with, because every story is rooted in some question that a writer has, that writer may or may not be conscious of. And so that I was gratified to know that how authentic the roots, the things that's instigated the story and moved me to even explore this particular story, um, remained consistent and significant. Um, I also saw how hard I had worked. I was like,
Yeah.
all the striving it brought back, and despite the frustration of not getting it right over so much time, over so much time, I was struck with the patience it takes, with the commitment it takes. Perhaps I could use the word devotion it takes to actually move something to the point where, um, but happily I'm receiving, people's responses in a very positive way. Um, so those were the things that um, really were the most important things that I noticed. I mean, it changed, but the core stayed the same, and it sure takes a lot of work and patience to make it happen.
Definitely. Yeah. When I finish a really authentic short story or one that, that has done all of these things, it's really interesting because I'm hyper focused on the last couple of pages because
Yeah.
you can see when the end is coming up. Um, and so I'm hyper focused, but I'm also like my mind is somehow enacting the lightness that you're talking about, right?
Oh,
You're like
nice.
you're like floating while hyper
Awesome.
aware.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So yeah, no, I love it. I'm really glad I got to read your collection, and it was a great pleasure talking with you about all of these things. I feel like I learned a lot today.
Oh, great, great. And if you, I don't know if you have time. We've been talking for a long time, but I'd love to read a little bit of Stephen Millhauser's "The Ambition of the Short Story" as a final thing. Do we have time? I mean, you can.
We got time.
I'll throw it in. So and I'm a big supporter, a big advocate for the short story as a genre. And he wrote The Ambition of the Short Story. He says, the short story, how modest in bearing, how unassuming in manner. It sits there quietly, eyes lowered, almost as if trying not to be noticed. And if it should somehow attract your attention, it says quickly in a brave little self-deprecating voice, alive to all the possibilities of disappointment. I'm not a novel, you know, not even a short one. If that's what you're looking for, you don't want me. Rarely has one form so dominated another. And we understand. We nod our heads knowingly. Here in America, size is power. The novel is the Walmart, the Incredible Hulk, the jumbo jet of literature. The novel is insatiable. It wants to devour the world. What's left for the poor short story to do? It can cultivate its garden, practice meditation, water the geraniums in the window box. It can take a course in creative nonfiction. It can do whatever it likes, so long as it doesn't forget its place, so long as it keeps quiet and stays out of the way. Hoo-ha, cries the novel. Here I come. The short story is always ducking for cover. The novel buys up the land, cuts down the trees, puts up the condos. The short story scampers across the lawn, squeezes under a fence. Of course, there are virtues associated with smallness. Even the novel grant as much. Large things tend to be unwieldy, clumsy, crude. Smallness is the realm of elegance and grace. It's also the realm of perfection. The novel is exhaustive by nature, but the world is inexhaustible. Therefore, the novel, that Faustian striver, can never attain its desire. The short story, by contrast, is inherently selective. By excluding almost everything, it can give perfect shape to what remains. Isn't that great?
Yeah, that is great. That's really great.
So I'm totally going to use that in the panel at AWP in Seattle for the Ambition of the Short Story panel. I have 4 short story writers, including myself, talking about why we're advocates for the short story, why we're doing it, and we don't feel like it's on the way to something else. It is what it is what we want to do.
Awesome. Well, be sure to check out Leslie's book, The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, on Sarabande Books. Check her out in Seattle at AWP on her panel. Thank you so much for joining me today, Leslie.
Okay, Matthew. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it so much.